Coffee with Coker is a healthcare business podcast from the Coker Group that focuses on solutions to help healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry landscape.
So welcome everyone to another edition of the Coffee with Coker podcast. Today's topic that has been quite candidly on everyone's mind is cyber liability insurance, and are you adequately covered? And so before we get into the interview, a couple just small housekeeping items. If you haven't done so already, please follow us on all the social media platforms, and you can find this podcast on all the major podcasting platforms such as Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, etc. And so always grateful for our followers. So thank you for joining us. And today we'll be interviewing Dan Stewart today. And Dan actually was here in the studio 2 years ago. It's crazy how much has changed in the world in 2 years and how fast time has flown by. And in fact, the last time Dan was here, we were covering cybersecurity in the general sense. So it's going to be interesting to see how his perspective has changed on that. But we've known Dan for a number of years. In fact, Dan is the president of Jackson Health Tech Advisors, and he's been a card-carrying Coker consultant partner with us for the last 3-4 years now, Dan? Okay.
Yes.
And Dan works closely with us on all things cybersecurity, as we oftentimes have clients who are either dealing with a breach or an incident or just needing general guidance. Dan has been in healthcare industry for over 30 years, and most of that, at least for the last 10 years, has been focused exclusively on cybersecurity risk management and the mitigation of threats and helping people provide services around reducing threats. And this also includes, which is why we're here today, the Cyber Liability Insurance Service programs that we're offering and support. So Dan, welcome back to the studio. And like I said, it's been too long, but always good to see you again.
Absolutely, Jeffrey. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's been a little while, but there's been things happening over the last 2-3 years that have caused that, I'm sure.
Certainly. And I think what caught our attention was we had a couple instances, and I know we got some questions prepared, but just to sort of set the stage, there's been instances where practices and health systems had cybersecurity insurance. They go to make a claim, and the first thing the cybersecurity insurance company will do is request information in accordance to the policy. So, for example, they would ask, were you conforming to all the things you said you would do, such as running your cybersecurity risk assessments? Did you have encryption? Were you doing phishing campaigns? And what we discovered is that they actually were looking for reasons to deny the claim. And those were one of the things that I think clients weren't aware of. They thought they had insurance, they had coverage, but they didn't know that they were accountable to maintaining their end of the obligation. And we've heard on multiple occasions that even though they had cybersecurity insurance, like any other, I assume it's the same as car insurance everywhere else, the first thing they do before they pay the claim is, see if there was any reason to deny the claim. I know that's where we engaged you in one instance with a client up in Maryland that we had discovered that they had a policy, but they weren't doing any of the things. How common is that, Dan?
It's become increasingly common, just as the cybersecurity threat landscape has just evolved and grown significantly in the last 2.5 years. There's been so many more cyber events in all industries. But it's impacting healthcare, we believe, more so than a lot of the other industries. And I can talk a little bit about that. But as far as it's also impacted the carriers that provide the cyber liability insurance. And again, I can go into some of the reasons and some of the things that have changed. But to your question, they are really focusing on much more aggressive underwriting and stringent cybersecurity requirements for the care providers to even attain proper coverage. So now when you fill out an application, they're going to say, okay, you need to have multi-factor authentication. You need to do encryption. You need to do endpoint detection and response, network segmentation, regular backups. All of those kind of things are now requirements, and they will make you prove that you have those capabilities within your cybersecurity program. And if you can't prove that, then they won't underwrite.
Right. Well, I know when it's probably not much different than when you apply for life insurance, which I did recently. I was approaching 50 and everyone said, be sure you get your policy before you turn 50 because it's really brutal after that. But not only did they send someone out to my house to verify everything, they did their own testing. But I remember the nurse that came out, she said, make absolutely certain on that application you list every medication that you're taking, had been taken, every prior surgery, everything. She said, because if you unfortunately have an event, God forbid, and it was related to something in your past and you didn't disclose that, then they would use that as a denial. So I think not only do you have to comply, you also have to disclose, your history and past events, because the insurance carrier does need to understand the risks that they're getting into. And moreover, I do think, in fairness to insurance companies, whether it's health or auto, there's an expectation that you're doing your part and you're going to be a good partner in that relationship. I mean, it would be, insurance would skyrocket if they just covered everyone and didn't expect the other side to hold up their end of the bargain.
Right, absolutely. And one of the things that you find in the cyber liability insurance market itself is, unlike auto insurance or life insurance, there's really no statistics. There's no history of losses. So for the insurance company that does cyber to be able to project what their losses could be, they just don't have that information. And so the result of that is that the premiums over the last year and a half, 2 years, have gone up between 20 and 50%. And as I mentioned, they're much more stringent in terms of being able to underwrite. They're also putting limitations on coverage. So, for example, there's some insurance companies, some of the larger companies will no longer pay ransomware.
Wow.
And that was one of the problems. Again, over the last 2.5 years, the insurance companies have lost so much money because in healthcare, 61% of the ransomware attacks, the ransom was paid. And of course, what that does is certainly incent and reinforce for these adversaries to increase some of the variants of ransomware and to increase their attacks.
Right.
And so I think in probably 2021, the U.S. healthcare system lost $21 billion just due to ransomware attacks alone because of downtime. And of course, the insurance companies paid a lot of that.
Right. That may actually explain. I ran across an interesting article, which I don't know if these two words really go together. I certainly don't ever hear them go together, but there is something called ethical hacking, where the hackers are trying to time and predict the market. So more recently, they've actually lowered their ransom because they discovered that they priced themselves out. And I guess the insurance, as you were saying, started excluding that from the policy. But more importantly, on the ethical hacking piece, it's like considered really unethical among hackers to not release the data after somebody pays it. So they actually honor their word that they give you back your data, they open back up access. And the reason for that is they discovered if they didn't, comply with giving you back, then no one would pay it. So there's actually, it's considered unethical in their world to not give you back the data or open back up. But of course, once, as you get hit, that information is then sold multiple times in the dark web, and it's, everybody else gets access to it. And so they tend to come back knocking more frequently. But I thought that was interesting that the hackers were actually lowering the prices because two things: they probably priced themselves out. And then it sounds like what you said, the insurance companies have started excluding that. So interesting. But anyways, let's get back on track. I didn't mean to throw you off on the list of questions, but I wanted to set that as the stage or the opening, because I do think a common misconception in cybersecurity liability insurance is that, hey, I have a policy, I'm good. And you might not be as good as you think, especially if you're not complying with some of the fine print. So let's do this real quick. I know, like we said, it's been a couple of years. Maybe just start by, what is the current landscape, and perhaps compare that. I know one of the things that, that came from COVID is everybody went remote, everybody went home. And unfortunately, that opened up a lot of opportunities for the cyber criminals, because now they're attacking home networks. We're now doing things more remotely. We quickly went into that type of environment. And so I think anytime you have something that dramatic happening that fast, it changes the threat level, the strategies, and things we have to protect ourselves. But maybe cover the current threat landscape and what you're seeing.
Sure. Yeah. And as you mentioned earlier, we did a podcast together at the beginning of 2020, and it was really looking at, okay, what's the current state of cybersecurity in healthcare? And we focused on the importance of ongoing cybersecurity hygiene, which included regular assessments and remediation, because even at that time, it was a huge problem in the industry and actually across all industries. If you look at now 2.5 years later, the threat landscape continues to evolve, and it's grown exponentially over that period of time. And that's resulted in a significant increase in the number of cyber events in all industries. But we believe that it's felt much more acutely in healthcare. To put it in perspective, according to the IBM Ponemon Institute cost of the data breach report for 2021, the average cost of a data breach across all industries was $4.24 million. But in healthcare, it was more than double that. It was $9.23 million. And you can look at that and say, well, okay, yeah, but that's skewed. That number's skewed because there were several really large data breaches, and that kind of pops the number up. Absolutely true. But still, if you think about it, it's an awful lot of money, even if you're a small healthcare provider. And the important factor there is that $9.23 million per incident was almost 30% higher than the previous year. So, and then as we look at 2022, we're halfway through 2022, it's not slowing down. The growth of threats continue to increase. At the end of June, there was 337 data breaches that were reported, accounting for more than 19 million records. And if you think about it, the 337, they only count breaches that are 500 records or more. So it continues to grow, and there's several reasons for that, and I can kind of go through those quickly. One, the hackers are much more sophisticated with their technologies, with the variants and the approaches that they use, and they seem to be staying one step ahead of our clients' security and privacy programs. Secondly, there's been a tremendous surge in ransomware attacks, especially in healthcare. I mentioned that couple of minutes ago with regard to the insurance companies, but 66% of the healthcare organizations have been hit with ransomware over the last 2 years. And there is a willingness within healthcare to pay the ransomware. It's the highest of any industry, which is 61% of the time. And so what this does, among other things, and you mentioned that it sort of makes the hackers a little bit more ethical. And it's become a huge business, certainly for them, but it also it emboldens them and reinforces and incents them to not only increase in the number of, if you would, companies that do hacking, but also to continue to exploit organizations. We've got several clients that have been hit multiple times. So the hackers keep coming back to continue to exploit the organizations. So that's a huge, huge issue, and probably the biggest change, again, over the last 2.5 years since we did the podcast back in 2020. Nation states have also increased their activities. Iran, China, North Korea, Russia, they're targeting U.S. infrastructure, and particularly the critical infrastructure of healthcare. If you look at it from our clients' perspective, there's still a huge workforce shortage. There's funding issues. As you mentioned, Jeffrey, pandemic-related work environment changes, telehealth, remote working functions, all of these contributed to increased vulnerability from a client perspective, and overall, a kind of a lower level of security maturity and compliance. And lastly, it's such a challenge, if you think about it from a healthcare organization standpoint, to really, the first thing they have to do is determine what their risk level is. And that's not easy to do typically. But once they determine that, then they have to choose the right cybersecurity vendors that they want to bring in to help solve the right problems. And really what makes it more complicated, if you look at the industry today, this is hard to believe, but there are over 3,500 cybersecurity vendors in the marketplace today. So it's incredibly confusing for the clients to really be able to put all of this together. So those are some of the reasons why I think we've seen such an increase in the cybersecurity threat landscape.
I think the other thing we witnessed in our industry before COVID, you had some major breaches at big box name stores like Target, Sony. I think Facebook was even hit, and these made national news. But what it also did is it drove that segment of our industry to really harden their data centers and their environment. So what the hackers by nature tend to be lazy individuals. In fact, I hear that they will focus on average, 2 to 3 hours before they'll move on to the next target. What they're essentially looking for is the soft targets, the easy, quick wins in and out. And healthcare, and specifically practices, maybe not as much hospitals, although small critical access hospitals are considered soft targets. Rural hospitals are places where you don't have a great deal of infrastructure or staff to monitor or tools to monitor. And so I think by and large, healthcare is considered soft targets for those reasons, but also the level of IT complexity within those ecosystems. You can find, even in the smallest practice, 6, 7, 8 different applications. And then you layer on, the Internet of Things that the staff brings in, and the fact that they're working from home, and at the home, they're using, residential grade routers and switches or no managed switches at all. So it's kind of just this free for all when it comes to medical practices, health systems. They're considered very, very soft targets. And a lot of these breaches, at least what we're seeing when we get an incident that comes in to be reported, they're very low tech. In fact, the most common one is a social engineering concept where they will trick an individual, usually on a personal level, through their Facebook or one of their consumer apps that they use. And it just so happens that app is the same exact password that they use to log into their electronic health record. And so once they compromise the employee one spot, they usually can compromise them in multiple places, or the deviation of that password. So a lot of times people think this is this advanced Russian code cracking, expert somewhere, in a data center offshore, but it's usually a very low tech. An employee clicks on a link they shouldn't. They've opened up a Trojan horse, or in many cases, they just simply relinquish their credentials they give them by being tricked into it. So I think that's a good segue into the next question that we have is, well, then how does cyber liability insurance protect? I know you mentioned that the policies are getting more expensive, more restrictive, and they're kind of wising up to some things, but clearly you still advocate for people to have insurance, and it's extremely important. I mean, at 9.2 million being the average, I don't know many, especially private practices, that have that kind of money sitting around. And plus, not only do you have the 9.2 million, you probably have ongoing cost in rebuilding your reputation, communicating with patients. You have, as you mentioned, most of these practices get hit 2-3 times again. So now you have to double down on your infrastructure to protect it because they're come knocking again. So let's talk a little bit about why the coverage is so important.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Healthcare is a target for the reasons that you mentioned, the reasons that I mentioned, but also just the value of the data, the protected health information, et cetera. And the bottom line is that with the current and the projected healthcare cybersecurity threat landscape, if you have not been attacked, then it's not a question of if you will be attacked. It's just a question of when you'll be attacked and how you will be attacked. So cyber liability insurance now has become, we believe, an essential part of your cybersecurity program. So cybersecurity insurance can help organizations mitigate risk through managing the fallout from a cyber attack. The proper type and level of insurance will transfer much of the risks, the financial damages, and you mentioned some. They'll transfer those to the insurers, and those are things like loss of productivity, service disruption, damage, as you mentioned, to the reputation, response and recovery activities like forensics, legal, incident response, planning, even hiring and negotiator, victim notification, public relations, credit monitoring. And as I mentioned earlier, less actually paying the ransomware. And then there's also the regulatory fines, and we're seeing a lot more claims that are being filed by the patients themselves and the employees. But it's important to note that cyber liability insurance is not a substitute. And I want to emphasize that it's not a substitute for strong cybersecurity controls. So you've got to have a comprehensive security program. You've got to have an incident response planning, and all of that in conjunction with the right cyber liability insurance policy so that you can appropriately lower risk and lessen the impact of a data breach. Now, again, I'm putting quotes around the word right cyber liability insurance policy, because you can get the wrong types and amounts of coverage. And many times that's worse than not having coverage at all.
Right. And just to call out one area that's not oftentimes thought about is this whole business interruption, because if a practice goes down and you're not able to operate and see patients, that could be tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands a day, per week, per month. And the longer that goes on, that really starts to add up, not to mention that you probably could even take on some patient safety issues, meaning that you are not able to know what medications were given, maybe loss in follow-up, things akin to that. So it has this sort of cascading effect that continues to go on and on. And by the way, before I forget, we'll have a link, but I know you published an article for us not long ago that covers in a little bit more detail all these elements that would be covered by cyber insurance, as well as some ways to make sure that you stay in compliance with the policy. Let's talk about how the threat landscape has affected the cybersecurity insurance market. I mean, I know you touched on it. Is it largely being driven by I assume they go hand in hand. So you have a large increase of incidents. The incidents are getting more sophisticated, more advanced. The cyber criminals continue to stay one step ahead. Is this just a simple rebalancing of the risk, and they just, like you said, there's no stats, so they're essentially increasing pricing as a way to offset that?
I think that's a big part of it. You could look at the cyber liability insurance market as they're really moving into uncharted territory. They really have no idea how the cyber threat landscape is going to continue to evolve. They just know it will, and it's going to continue to grow. So what's happened is they've basically lost money. And many carriers that provided cyber liability insurance 2 years ago have gone out of the business. They're not doing it anymore. So if there's still a large number of carriers out there, but I can tell you from experience, there's only 6 to 8 that are legitimate and really understand the market and will provide not only the first party and third party services, but will also provide the ancillary services and really help you focus on response and recovery once you've been hacked. But because they've lost so much money, as I said, there's less carriers in the market. I mentioned earlier, there's a 20 to 50% increase in policy premiums. There's more limitations on coverage. No longer some of them will pay ransomware. Some of the insurers are walking back some of their response and recovery services. And then most importantly, there's more aggressive underwriting. And the insurance companies are at the point where if you can't prove that you are doing things that you need to do from a cybersecurity program perspective, then they're just not going to insure you.
Right. Well, as we kind of wrap up here, I know one of the things that we always like to leave people with is sort of what should they do? How can we provide support and guidance? And I think given that the carriers are contracting both in terms of services, payouts, the scope, it's probably very important that you truly compare, make sure that the current policy that you've been paying is adequately covered. Sometimes payers will just simply mail you one of these random notices that we made changes to the policy, and no one actually goes back and compares and reads. I know that we have, in a number of instances, have helped people shop and compare Are the prices? It sounds like the market's kind of on the uptick as far as increasing. Do you find that some of the prices are negotiable, or at least the coverage? Can you engage these carriers to readjust or customize plans that's specific for this particular client? I mean, how do we go about shopping and helping people compare options, and more specifically negotiate a good contract so they're well protected and they understand what is truly covered and what's not covered?
Another fallout from what's going on from the cyber liability insurance market itself is there is just a plethora of coverage types and amounts and limitations and triggers and all of this kind of stuff. So you have a lot of these insurance carriers that will have a policy that's for a small organization, a medium organization, a large organization, and those are different. And they are flexible in terms of some of the ancillary services that they'll provide. What they're not flexible in is the only way that you're going to get covered and the only way that you're going to get a decent price from a premium perspective is to really have a good comprehensive cybersecurity program in place. And again, as we've talked about, is to be able to prove that. But the other thing, because of all of these endorsements and exclusions and all of these new types of policies, it makes it increasingly difficult for the healthcare provider to really understand what the coverages would be and what they need. And so that's why, we can provide some of those services to make sure that they attain the right coverage at, most importantly, an affordable price.
Right. So going back to my life insurance example, it's really important that we present, or a client presents themselves or a health system to a carrier in a way that they look like the perfect picture of health, right? Because when you're applying for life insurance, it's extremely important. You're going to pay a big difference in premiums if you're a smoker or non-smoker, if your weight is within the right expected range for your age and height, that kind of stuff. So when cybersecurity insurance companies and liability insurance are looking to insure someone, I assume part of that assessment is how advanced and how proactive has this practice or health system been in terms of hardening their data centers and things akin to that. So they do factor those things into the premiums.
Absolutely. They basically will have an application that is increasingly long. I mean, it's a lot more pages than it used to be. And they ask you everything. They ask you about your current level of protection. They ask you, have you been hacked? And if so, what are the details of that? Are you utilizing multi-factor authentication across your organization? Basically, they're asking you to prove to them or to tell them what you're doing from a cybersecurity standpoint today. And they also will go in at times and they'll do scans, vulnerability scanning and things like that to see if you're really doing what you're telling them.
A trust and verify program.
That you're doing. That's the only way that you're going to, like life insurance, that's the only way that you're going to get maybe a lower premium. But remember, they're not going to cover you at all if you're not going to do these things that they're going to require to make sure that their risk is, in their minds at least, is manageable.
Yeah, I know. I mean, the first time I became aware of some of these limitations and risks with insurance is we had a client in West Georgia who lost a laptop. Honest mistake, happens all the time. And I remember the policy, they contacted their insurance and this laptop had a lot of PHI. I mean, like a lot of PHI on it. I think it was 30, 40,000 records. It was the entire database. And so naturally they had to report that and OCR got involved and whatnot. But I remember the question when the insurance company got engaged, they said, well, you had encryption on the laptop, right? And they said, no, not this laptop. And immediately that was the end of they just shut it down and they denied the claim because in the policy that the client signed said that they would in fact provide encryption on their laptops. And this one particular laptop didn't have it. And I can't go into all the details for confidentiality reasons, but that's kind of the reason why I think it's extremely critical that if you're going to get cybersecurity insurance, you also have to know what your obligations are and commitments, because that will be, and not only the insurance, the government will do the same thing. When they go to determine if you should pay a penalty or not, they will ask, well, did you do your SRA? And they become a lot less forgiving when you cannot demonstrate that you were practicing good cybersecurity hygiene, as you mentioned a second ago. So if there's anything that we can leave our audience with today, check your policies, make absolutely certain that you know what your commitments and obligations are, so you don't run into an instance where they're denying your claim. And last but not least, please take us up on all the free resources. There'll be links here that you can get access to some of our articles. And as always, you're more than welcome to call or email. There'll be a link to Dan's email as well as myself. If you have any questions, we're more than happy at no cost to you to take a call and try to answer any questions that you might have. So with that, Dan, any closing remarks? Or
to the point you're making, to really get the right coverage for a healthcare organization, it is really a step-by-step evaluation process. So that includes some of the things you mentioned. A detailed review of their current policy or policies, an evaluation of the organization itself to help determine what are the potential needs of your organization. We look at revenue, number of employees, stored records, PCI requirements, capital reserves, et cetera, and then a high-level assessment of your current security and privacy program. And the results of that assessment, as you mentioned, the SRAs before, is the areas requiring remediation, not only to strengthen your overall program, but to allow you as a healthcare provider to qualify for underwriting. Then once that happens, you need to match the carriers that provide those required policies and coverage is needed and complete the applications for underwriting. The next step then is to review the results, make a selection on the best fit and what's the best balance between the coverage that you need as an organization and its affordability. And finally, finalize the policy and execute the agreement. And in partnership with Coker Group, we've developed a program to be able to help our clients go through this step-by-step process. And we can provide all of these services, as I just went through, or select services depending on the specific needs of the organization.
Yeah, and I'll add one other thing, because we didn't mention it this entire interview session, but one mistake that a lot of people make is, or I hear this comment a lot, is that, well, we're using a cloud-based vendor and therefore we've offloaded that to someone else. But if your vendors get breached, you're just as much as responsible for your vendors as you are yourself. So make sure that your vendors also have cyber liability insurance, because if they get hit, that will become your problem as well too. And so you got to make sure you get your BAs in place. So just wanted to point that out.
Absolutely. That's the third parties. You see a lot of breaches that are initiated within the third parties, and some of these insurance policies. One of the things that you'll need to look at is contingent business interruption component of your policy, and that's if you have a third party vendor that you depend on, and if they're breached, even if that doesn't breach you, but it impacts your revenue and your productivity, then your insurance carrier will pay for that.
That's a good point. Awesome. Well, Dan, you're always a wealth of knowledge, and always enjoy having you in the studio to share this information. Again, I know this is not the most exciting topic. I think somebody once said they'd rather go watch paint dry. So I understand that it's not one that is always a high priority, but it certainly becomes a very high priority when you ever have an incident or breach, and that's not the time to start worrying about it. So take full advantage of Dan's expertise, and feel free to contact either one of us. And like I said, there'll be links to some of the material and articles. And as always, thank you for listening, and please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thanks, everyone.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We would love to hear them and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter at Coker Group, and then on LinkedIn, you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us in a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback. And we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes.